Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Lopez, the Chief Digital Officer here at New York Public Library. For those of you in the room and for those of you watching online, we welcome you to Live at NYPL. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As Chief Digital Officer here at NYPL, I'm responsible for ensuring we deliver exceptional digital experiences and leverage technology to expand access and use of this incredible societal good that is the New York Public Library. I came to this field a little over a year and a half ago from the tech and finance world, and I'll tell you that it's been incredibly pleasurable to be a technologist at an iconic institution like NYPL. Every day I use technology for the betterment of society, particularly in a time where technology and technology companies are questioned. There really is a question of who benefits from technology. Tonight, I feel even more fortunate to introduce two incredible legal forces making sense of how technology and technology companies should be delivering on behalf of real people. Tim Wu, the Julius Silver Professor of Law, Science, and Technology at Columbia Law School, has served both in the Biden and Obama administrations, advising at different points the White House and the Federal Trade Commission on issues around technology and competition. He's also a gifted writer, helping explain how today's technology companies and technology are operating in the world. He will be in conversation with Lina Khan, who until earlier this year served as the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. She too is a gifted writer and probably wrote the most viral legal article ever written, fundamentally transforming the modern day understanding of antitrust. She's now an associate professor with Tim at the Columbia Law School, and as of this week is the co-chair for Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani's transition campaign. I could speak for ages on their many accomplishments and the role they've played to shape the limits technology companies have on the impact of real people, but I'll hold myself back, I'll let them do it. They're gonna talk about Tim's latest book, The Age of Extraction. In it, Tim examines how today's tech giants extract wealth from ordinary citizens and deepen America's class divide through their increasingly more powerful platforms. It asks how the internet went from being a celebrated platform or celebrated as democratizing force promising widespread prosperity to one that has fueled the rise of new economic hierarchies and widening the wealth gap and deepening inequality. Here at NYPL, we think deeply about technology and how it can be an enabler for good, but we also see how every day the wealth gap is widening and the digital divide has made lasting effects on our communities. So let's just say that I'll be listening quite intently in today's conversation. At the end of today's talk, Tim will take a few of your questions. You should have received note cards on your way in. Please write down your questions clearly in question form, and my colleagues from the library will take them from you. And don't worry if you're listening to us on video, please put your questions in the chat. We want to hear from all of you. When we're done with today's discussion, you can find copies of Tim's book for sale outside the auditorium. Proceeds will go to the New York Public Library. Tim will be up here on stage signing those copies, and if you pre-ordered your book but haven't yet picked it up, just feel free to head out there and grab your book. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, you can get access to the book with us. And if you don't have a card, what are you waiting for? Go to nypl.org, you can sign up there. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Espahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without you. We build this community together. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us and building the magic that will happen today in the room. Thank you so much for your support. And now please join me in welcoming Tim Wu and Lina Khan.
Good evening, everybody. It's so great to be here, and a special honor to get to be here with Tim Wu, a colleague of mine and longtime friend. Tim has this incredible ability to write books at the perfect moment, and The Age of Extraction is no exception, so I'm thrilled we'll get a chance to talk about it. I'll kick it off with asking some questions, and then I understand we'll have some opportunity for audience Q&A. So Tim, you opened the book by, talking about how this is, on the one hand, a story about tech platforms and how they have become so much more extractive, but also a larger story about the economy. And you kind of draw this connection between the role that these middlemen are playing and the economic precarity and marginalization that we are seeing across our country with, young people finding it harder to buy homes, more people living paycheck to paycheck. Talk to us about what the connection is between what's happening over here in tech and what's happening in the broader economy.
Sure thing. And first of all, it's just great to be here. I'm just very pleased. Thanks to the library for holding this event. Thanks to you all for showing up. I really appreciate it. And I actually am on book tour, so I'm just here for an evening, and it's just incredibly great to be back in New York and see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. So I wrote this book responding to what I think is a profound change in our economy and methods of doing business. I feel that we have increasingly moved to an economy where the dominant way of making money is less about trying to invent a new product and sell it for a reasonable price, and more about looking for pain points, more for looking for places where you have power over somebody and trying to extract as much as you can. That is what I think has been a shift. And I guess I'm saying it's not a good thing. and I see this, I think particularly, the book is mainly about the rise of the main tech platforms as kind of a case study of this phenomenon. I think that the tech platforms, began, for those of us who were around in the 90s and hanging out, began as these sort of wonderful beacons of hope that were going to basically make everybody rich and also spread democracy to every corner of the world and just do all kinds of good things. And over the course of the last 25 years or so, they have really fundamentally changed and become some of the most advanced technologies of wealth extraction ever designed. Actually, it's not limited to wealth, but also data, your attention, your time. And so part of what this book is trying to do is tell that story of essentially what happened to the dream of the 90s as a way of trying to understand or diagnose how we move to this extractive economy that is focused everywhere on the idea of how can you just get as much out of people with the market power you have.
You note in the book that, on the one hand, platforms are nothing new. One way to think about platforms is that they're forms of middlemen, intermediaries that are connecting different sets of people. So you talk about the ancient bazaar. We can even think about the railroads as a form of platform, telecom. And at various points, society has reckoned with the challenges that come with dominant middlemen in particular, and introduced a whole set of rules and regulations to make sure that their economic power is actually accountable to the public in one way or another. Do you see the tech platforms as part of that tradition, and society has just not yet caught up to kind of apply the same sets of interventions than we have in the past, or is there something different here?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. People write books in different ways, and one of the ways I write a book is I have a sentence and then I follow that sentence where it's going to go and see kind of what happens. And for this book, I was like, okay, what am I going to do for this book? And the sentence that came to me when I was walking on 25th Street one day was, everything has to happen somewhere. I don't know, it doesn't seem that profound, but I was like, it's in the book, somewhere in chapter 2. When I thought about that, because it seemed kind of obvious, but what I meant by that is that I was thinking that every society, every civilization has spaces where transactions happen, people buy and sell, People meet each other, make connections. Speech happens. People hear and learn things. I was reminded of this last week. I was in Rome with my kids, and when in Rome you go to the Forum, you walk around, and the Roman Forum, it was all there. They have the market where everybody buys and sells. They have the places where Cicero gave his speeches. They have the law courts right next to there. They also have all the temples. So everything was in this space. And one of my deepest beliefs is that the nature, the shape, the rules surrounding these platforms or public fora fundamentally shape what kind of civilization you live in and what kind of society you're in. So, these spaces, everything has to happen somewhere, but then where that is or what that space is like is going to do a lot to determine who we are, what society we live in, whether it's open, whether it's closed, whether it's what it is. And, you can see this if you go through human history. So I think there's a reason the Greek agora was so famous, and, you had democratic debates and speeches, and Rome sort of mimicked that. Other civilization, in Persia, they had the bazaars. In China, the market towns. Medieval England had a big market town to drive the rise of an independent farming class, for example. There's a lot of class things built in what kind of spaces. Maybe I'm getting a little academic here. But if you think about those fora, which I think have been key to every civilization, and you compare it with what we have today, you'll notice there are some really big differences. Maybe first and most fundamental, that our major platforms are all private now. The virtual platforms, first of all, they become virtual as opposed to physical. And the main buying and selling places and the main speaking places are all privately owned, sometimes by one person, sometimes corporations. They are all profit-seeking. They all have a incentive to try to extract as much fees and data and attention from you as possible. And they all just basically have an agenda of a kind that would seem so weird for like an ancient Greek or someone from another civilization just saying, how did you let this happen? So I feel we have allowed the major, what are truly public spaces in our time, become these sort of twisted for-profit enterprises would have their own agendas. And even we just let something, you think about Twitter, which had become sort of the public forum. We just sort of let some random dude buy it. Can you imagine ancient Rome? Someone said, I'm buying the forum. And now whoever wants to speak, they come to me. I'm not saying the emperors were perfect in how they did things, but, it is crazy that we've let this happen. And that's sort of partially what the deeper story of this book, is how we allowed the most important public facilities, public spaces, essential parts of our civilization to become subject to this strange, weird, private business model that is the tech platform business model.
In the 90s and even into the early 2000s, there was extraordinary optimism about what the internet would mean, about its potential as a liberating force for information, for commerce, for people's freedom. And, I think we've seen over the last few decades that sense of optimism really diminish and give way to the reality that these firms are now running ecosystems that are, in fact, often the exact opposite, right? Extraordinarily closed, extraordinarily private. Instead of having freedom, you're now subject to their arbitrary whim and coercion. What is your assessment of how that happened? We both have written a lot about how there were various policy and legal decisions that allowed this to happen. Do you put this all at the doorstep of DC, or are there other factors that you think contributed here?
Yeah, sure. So first thing when I write a book, I have a sentence. But second, I think maybe this is better, is I usually have a story in mind or a puzzle. And for me, one of the things that motivated me writing this book is whatever happened, to the dream of the 90s, basically. What happened to the promise that the internet was going to make everybody rich, that anyone could kind of start their own business and turn their hobby into their career, or harness their talent, and not like maybe partially get by, but actually have that be their livelihood in a really concrete way. And I kind of wanted to tell that story in this book. One of the things I did to research this book is I went back to sort of the 90s and early thousands and read, Wired magazine from that period, and read all the stuff, and it was a very hopeful time. I remember Clay Shirky in 2008 said, like, the internet is powered by love, basically. Tim Berners-Lee said it's like, there was the emotion. There's been a big shift in the emotions that I have a lot to say on this topic, but there's a big shift in, I think, the emotional bases that were relied on. In the 90s and early thousands, sharing, kindness, collaboration, acts of love and generosity, that was imagined to be like the main way that the internet and the web were successful. It almost seems amazing to think that that was what, was the core belief. But I think everything shifted at 2 points. One was the early 2000s. And I want to focus on that point because there were a lot of companies, Google maybe being the best example, that had a very idealistic kind of vibe going on to them. And a lot of people, well-intentioned people I know, went to work for Google during this phase. There's two theories about this. One of them is that it was all just kind of sediments for suckers and like an act to get the big money. But I think it was, what happened was more the byproduct of kind of a classic, certainly Silicon Valley, maybe American sin, which is that idea you could really have it all. And so I think that initial generation wanted to do good, had the idea that they were going to, for example, give the world access to information or connect each other, Facebook, but they also had to be billionaires. Like, that was somehow essential. Yeah, they make a ton of money. And they, as I said, they wanted to have it all. Like, they couldn't compromise. So when all these companies went public, they chose, and I sort of talk about this in the book, they chose just a normal Delaware corporation, the same model as like U.S. Steel, the same model as any company out there, with investor pressure to constantly double their profits and margins, so forth. But in Google's case, they wrote a little letter to their shareholders. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but they said, dear, a note to our shareholders, we're not a normal company. We never want to be one. We're going to lose money. We value our users more than our advertisers, all this kind of stuff. Actually, you read it now, and they have violated every single thing in that letter. But it's full of all this stuff. It leads to, for me, what was one of the lessons of this era, one of the fundamental failures, too, which, in the long run, structure beats out good intentions. And so they thought if we were really nice guys, everyone's like, these guys are great, and everything, just all these kind of good vibes were supposed to carry the day. But structurally, everybody chose the classic Delaware corporate model. And the only exception, and I give him a lot of credit, was Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia. So Jimmy Wales, at the same time, his website was almost the same traffic as Google. If he had sort of flipped the switch, he could have flipped a switch and become a billionaire. Maybe a millionaire first, but he could have flipped a switch and turned the money machine on and just become one of the wealthiest men on earth. And he didn't do it. I think he was a little older than these guys, and I think you could see that the result of that was going to be a very different thing than the encyclopedia that claimed to represent the truth and so forth. It was just not going to work with an advertising model. I remember there was a story, I think in New York Magazine, that was essentially mocking Wales for having not become rich. He's still a multimillionaire, but for not becoming rich, and it was all about how all these other guys. But I look back at it 25 years later. He has a product he can be proud of, and he himself can, walk around with his head held high. The rest of them have become these extractive machines, or they've helped throw elections, or all of them have one sin after another. And I think it comes back to that desire to having had it all. So I'll leave it there.
And what do you attribute that to, that change in ethos or vibes, right? I mean, one could argue, well, look, people have always been motivated by making money. That's why many of them are going into these lines of business. Was it just a brief moment in time where there was a view that the leaders of Silicon Valley were instead anomalously animated by altruism and kind of freedom of information, and then at some point that was just a flip?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think that, as I said, there's a cognitive dissonance of trying to hold two inconsistent things at once in their goals. So I think the individual founders and the companies wanted to feel this is very common actually in business, they wanted to feel they were doing good things in the world. Like somehow that seemed important to them. But then they also had to make a lot of money. And they set up, again, structures that push them away from whatever good intentions. Scripture says you cannot serve two masters. They somehow thought they were an exception to the rule. But they weren't. I think the turning points, I talk about this book also, the 2010s is really the turning point in the last 10 years. There's a number of them I talk about, but maybe I'll talk about a change in the emotions to which people that become, or the impulses to which become those appealed to. So in the early days of the internet, as I said, it was like kindness and collaboration and sharing were really important to make everything work. 2010s, you see a turn to two different, I think, slightly darker forces. One is the power of addiction and of what's that word? Variable return schedules. Things that, like checking in on email, checking in on Facebook, where the variable reward schedule, that's what I'm looking for. So a whole set of setups that make people come back and come back and come back to things, and realizing you needed time and attention to power, particularly the advertising business model. And the other is, that I described in the book, is also, over the last 10 years, really a big bet on human laziness. Or maybe stated otherwise, every effort, I think, of the last 10 years has been to try to really make you feel like it would be an enormous pain to ever leave Amazon or Google or any of these platforms. It's just like too much of a pain. Even if the prices have gotten higher. Amazon's not cheaper anymore or anything. But just every factor to try to work with our love of convenience above all things. So harnessing these forces, I think, has been a shift in the business model. But as to the move, like was there a moment, was it always a plan to do this? I don't even think the founders know themselves.
Or was the sin going public, right? And then once you're kind of subject to the whims of like shareholder demands.
I mean, that's what I think. I think they chose a structure, and the structure took over. And, that was the sin. It was the choice of that structure.
I
and
mean,
the
in the
IPO.
case of Google, you noted the letter they wrote. I mean, there was also this famous essay that two of the founders wrote, noting that as individuals who are, now entering the general search business, and I will hand it to Google, they really genuinely innovated in terms of how they created the index and, their ability to basically create a single place where they'd be able to crawl the web and deliver to you all these results. But even at that moment, the founders themselves recognize that one of the major things that could corrupt the whole search engine model would be an ad-based business model, right? And so it seems like there were also specific business model decisions that ended up tipping in ways that maybe some of them had even anticipated.
No, that's what's kind of extraordinary about the story, particularly of Google, so it's sort of self-aware company. They in the very famous back rub paper, which described their algorithm, as you said, they have an appendix to the paper, which is a denouncement of advertising-driven search as inherently corrupt. So they knew it. They knew it.
And just to spell it out for people, the idea is that once the algorithm is instead motivated by what links will make the money rather than what links they think are most responsive to you, that itself is corrupting, the purity of just trying to show you what is most relevant, more or less.
Yeah. So, and maybe if I could take this lead, let me maybe tell another story of where I think that initial dream kind of went sideways. And that's the story of the Amazon marketplace, if I can segue into that. So, as I said earlier, I think one of the initial dreams of the internet, I said it would make everybody rich, it would give everyone the opportunity to start maybe their own business if they wanted to and sell whatever thing they might want to. And one of the most important marketplaces for that, I said the platforms are very important in any civilization, was the Amazon marketplace. So I don't know if you guys remember, but Amazon used to be a bookstore. A long time ago, and their basic shtick was we're bigger than the other bookstores. We have a huge, they were not like a platform or marketplace. They were not a normal bookstore, but like a bookstore. And then somewhere in, I think, the early 2000s, they invented the marketplace, so a place other people could sell on Amazon. And expanded to other products. They did this, they did that. And by 2012, approximately, they'd kind of solved a few problems and designed a very effective marketplace. Among other things, they realized that order fulfillment would be very important. If you read the old, I read all these old things, and everyone in the 90s was like, oh, eBay is going to be, this great liberation device. There's this great book called An Army of Davids, written by Glenn Reynolds, the University of Tennessee law professor. And he said, the future belongs to the Davids. And it's going to, be on eBay. They're all going to, eBay collectively is employing more people than Walmart, and the future belongs to the little guy. Rarely have a great set of predictions been so wrong as those in the early thousands and 90s. But anyway, so Amazon designed it. They figured out order fulfillment because it's hard to duct tape everything, and they did all this. And there was a period around 2012 where it was really starting to take off, and all kinds of people were, quitting their jobs or maybe starting a side job. I talk about a barber in Indiana who starts selling pomade, has a lot of success, starts hiring employees, people unemployed from the Great Recession. And there's and the key thing in that moment is that Amazon's take is only about between 15 and 20%. This is a little bit like your note, by the way. But it's a little bit like between 15 and 20%. So it's a relatively modest margin. So there's this moment where, in a sense, the dream of the 90s is maybe alive, and this could be a means of income redistribution or building some independent wealth. And people are going, and more and more people get onto it, and Amazon. And then at some point, Amazon outdistances eBay. They beat off Walmart. They buy a whole bunch of their competitors, which shamefully at the FTC we then allow them to do. I was at the FTC for some of those, unfortunately, because they buy off some dangerous competitors like Zappos or some other companies, and they've kind of got the position, they've achieved essentially the monopoly in online commerce. And then they start to turn the dial and add fees and move everything up. And, this is for sellers. Sellers pay a prime fee like we do, that starts going up. But the cleverest of them all, and in some ways the most insidious, is their advertising program. So have you ever searched something on Amazon and you get, it's all these sponsored results, and, you don't really know what it is you're looking for, whatever. So I got interested in those sponsored results. And so they have to bid, to show up at all. It was like 10 billion, 20 billion, started growing and growing. Do you know how much those sponsored results generated in revenue last year? In profit, sorry? $57 billion, which is double every single newspaper in the entire world advertising revenue. So they built this thing that, like in the original Google thing, makes the search worse. And it's just a very pure example of valueless extraction of profit. And the reason I raise this is not only because it is just a lot of money, but also because it kind of killed that dream that these marketplaces could become these places that distribute wealth very widely, or could be a place that people build their independent bases all around the country in favor of a system where it's an extraction to a very small number of monopolies. And I think that story kind of tells exactly what in some ways happened to the dream.
What's so remarkable about the Amazon example is, the FTC filed a suit against Amazon while I was there, and through that investigation, and this is even in the complaint.
What do you mean while you were there? While you were running the FTC?
While I was running the FTC. There was actually a debate internally about how much they should turn up the dial to allow ads to proliferate on the platform, and how much to turn up the dial to allow irrelevant ads to proliferate on the platform. And they actually calculated internally, they recognized, okay, the more you jack up the irrelevant ads, that is degrading the customer experience, is that gonna cost us? And they basically made a business decision saying, no, we are now at the point, we are so dominant that we can now extract even when we are making our product worse. And, we filed a whole bunch of lawsuits in all sorts of industries. And that was always a really interesting theme, that there were certain businesses that were able to deliberately make things worse. Another area where this comes up sometimes is subscription traps or dark patterns, when firms would recognize that they would be making it more difficult for customers to, exercise free will in terms of whether they do or don't want a subscription or do or don't want to cancel. But they recognized that their ability to just extract and kind of lock people in was overriding, any business need that they had to make their product good. You started off by talking about how one of the core animating insights was this idea that space structures activity. One area where that principle has been longstanding is in how we understand speech. And how human speech and speech across society is intimately linked to how we structure the law, how we structure spaces. You, of course, have written extensively about speech, about the First Amendment. Are there particular dynamics here that have played out in particular with how speech is now occurring on the internet through these platforms?
Yeah, I want to bring up a sort of under-remarked tragedy in our history of the last 10 years. And this is about Twitter, but it's not the moment where Elon Musk buys it. It's a slightly earlier point where, Twitter has never really made that much money, but it's not unimportant, and it had, by the 15 years ago, kind of become the place. And they were sort of not making enough money. They were trying to figure out what to do. There was a nonprofit consortium that said, well, why don't we take Twitter nonprofit? And for whatever reason, it didn't work out, and they did some other thing, it was just over and over again during this period, we just have somehow been structurally blind to how important these platforms are to our civilization. And speech is just one example. It is crazy. I think any other era would think it's crazy that you can have a wealthy person buy, they've always bought newspapers, but buy the sort of like what was becoming the fundamental forum for so much speech. We're getting the mistakes we made in the early thousands, I think, have led us to where we are today. Failure to pass privacy laws. So you end up essentially supporting business models that feed on trying to know who people are, trying to enrage them with various forms of information, advertise that. We just have, by failing to pay attention to structure, which doesn't sound very exciting, allowed ourselves to become, and it's not the only reason, obviously, but this incredibly polarized, incredibly outlandishly divided nation. And I think that the fault lies with us. Saying this, and going back to something earlier you said, when I think about what you said about Amazon and this what we've let our public fora become, or our essential infrastructures, it reminds me of how much we take for granted something like the electric network. We were much smarter when it came to electricity. So, electricity was once this new thing and really important to the economy, and every company needed it if you were building a toaster or even a computer or whatever it was. But we never had this thing where, like, the electric company could, I'll just charge any amount of money I want, or, I'm going to choose this company and they're going to get these favors and those won't. And, we had very strong limits because we realized, or nor did we say, all right, we'll rely on the electric company to invent everything, and you can't mess with them because they're going to invent everything, Like, we never said, we're going to have the electric company, they're going to invent the computer, they're going to invent, and I think we've gotten this weird trap where not only do we let the tech platforms take as much as they want, pile up this money, we say they have to do that because they're going to invent the future. Otherwise someone else will invent AI, or we'll lose the race to China, or something else will happen. So we've become kind of trapped, blackmailed by this craziness. When, frankly, if you look at the great periods of American building, they were on the back of neutral networks and infrastructures that gave a lot of people the chance to build. The building on top of the railroad after we put the railroad under common carriage, or that's a little technical, made the railroads into utilities and made them have fixed prices and made them serve everybody. Same with electric. Those were the great periods of American building, were on the back of infrastructure that didn't, and I guess this is something I say in the book, I think today's platforms have kind of developed a main character syndrome. They think that they're the story. You know what I mean? They think they're everything. They do take a lot of money, but the future needs to be built by a lot of people, not just them.
Historically, we have... Historically, we've seen that many of the breakthrough innovations, the paradigm innovations, have come from the outsiders, as you're alluding to, not from the incumbents, not from the existing gatekeepers, but from outsiders. And there's a lot of economic research asking this question of what is the best market structure that is most conducive to innovation, and the question basically comes down to, well, what type of innovation? And this is this traditional Jupiter v. Arrow debate. And more or less, monopolies, it seems, can be great at innovating when what you care about is incremental improvements. But historically, the real world-changing innovations have come from the outside disruptors. What's interesting as we're watching the onset of AI, the greater adoption of AI, is that many of the major players in those markets are the very same players that have been incumbents now for a decade. Partly that seems to have been because the incumbents have been strategic in their partnerships and investments to make sure that they get their tentacles into this next set of markets. But what do you think that means for, AI as a potential disruptive force that destabilizes the existing incumbents, and what types of, policy interventions do you think are needed to make sure that the type of blackmail that you're describing doesn't become even more intense with the AI race?
Yeah. Well, I have two things to say about that. So one of the reasons, first of all, that I'm a believer interested in this process of decentralized innovation is not just because of the results, but it also stands for a certain kind of freedom, I guess, is what I'd say. It's a certain kind of country that I like the idea of, which is a country where there's a lot of different people, a lot of different ideas trying things out. And it's not like you have to be in one of the big labs or working at the big companies to be have an important role in trying to figure out the future. And that's sort of just something I think, and I think the United States, and frankly the world, the United States has been at its best at its periods when we, like what I said with electricity, or where we have an opportunity for a lot of people to trial out a lot of different ideas. But on this specific question of AI and tech platforms, I think this is a very under-analyzed or under-noticed question, which is the relationship between the two. And I think antitrust people think about it, but I think that other people are more thinking about are robots going to take over and stuff like that, which I'm worried about that too, so I don't want to minimize that danger. But there are basically, there are the tech platforms, and there's this new technology called AI, which powers a number of possible new technologies. And my basic instinct is those two forces should be fighting each other as opposed to working together. The greatest danger in our time, I think, economically at least, is if AI becomes nothing more than a reinforcing mechanism for tech platform monopoly. Because then I think it's possible that it becomes impossible or very, very difficult to dislodge. Everybody who follows finance knows there's being extraordinary billions spent on artificial intelligence by big tech right now. And my main concern, and I'm trying to think why are they doing that? What's the return? I don't think anyone really knows. One answer is that they don't know either, and they're just in kind of a race. But another is that they sense in some way, here is an opportunity to keep the same racket going. I mean, they've got a good thing. And if you look over the long history of industry and of politics, people, when they get somewhere, don't want to leave. How many politicians start companies with great new products and all this exciting, idealistic stuff, and then 30 years later, they're just trying to feed their opponents to the crocodiles one way or another. And I think that there's an instinct in tech, big tech, that these huge inventions can put them in a position where they're unassailable, where they become, and whether it's because you'll have to build your own engine, whether it's because they master emotional reliance, which is, I think, coming. That is to say, you start to feel like your emotional needs are met by Siri or whoever your new friend is. I don't know. Whatever it is, I think they have some key there to hold on to power forever. It's like the quest for immortality, the last light. That is what I think is motivating. Do you notice that there's so much money in Silicon Valley put into human immortality? I think the AI investments are investments in corporate immortality or monopolistic immortality. So what should government do? Keep them apart, try and force them to fight. And if you were still there, that's what you'd be doing.
You talk in the book about the real road to serfdom, alluding to Hayek. Talk to us about what you mean by that.
Yes. So Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist in theory, he had this belief that the road to serfdom was basically well-intentioned building up of government, because he believed that government would you would have government take care of one problem, maybe like healthcare, and they grow into something else and take over too much. And I guess he was sort of thinking of Soviet Union and examples like that. I think the road to serfdom, the real road to serfdom, particularly in our time, is too little government or failure of government to do what people want or need that makes people turn to the strong man. So I'm not the first to say this, but I detail in the book a 5-step process by which you see this. The first is the monopolization of many sectors of the economy. And in the book, I talk not just about tech platforms, but how the similar extractive models in housing, the spread of extractive models in healthcare, often with private equity involved. It's not, a lot of people, businesses looked at the tech platforms and it's like, that looks like a good idea. We want that. And I think that you can see that spreading, and private equity has its own extractive models that are quite ingenious. So you have the monopolization of much of the economy. You then have a period of extraction from, almost a 2-class system from business, not only from customers, but also other parts of the economy. That causes a resentment, a mass resentment, which is a sort of political emotion that is driven not by the sense you individually are being treated unfairly, but a whole class is being treated unfairly, that you feel you're mad. And then comes this moment, this question of whether the government can deliver for you, can make things fairer, can, whether democracy works or not. And if it doesn't, and if people still feel like that no matter what they do, nothing is being fixed, it creates an opening for the strong man who's always done the same thing over the last 200 years, which is say, I really have your interests at heart. I will help you where nobody else does. Hugo Chavez said this when Venezuela was totally run by, Lenin said this to the Mussolini. If you read Mussolini's appeal, very similar. It's always the same thing. It's like I am truly on your side. Only I can do it, and trust me with it. So that is how, and I think in our time, I mean, I actually first wrote this years ago, and it's unfortunately increasingly become true, that around the world and in our country, we suffer because of democratic failure from a rise of strong men who appeal to people's deepest material interests.
Okay, great. I've gotten some questions here that I'll start going through. The first one is, how much is the venture capital model to blame for the current state of tech platforms?
That's a good question. I think there are. I don't think it would be fair to entirely blame venture capital. I think venture capital has a mixed role. So one thing that venture capital does is it, funds long shot investments, and I think there's been some really important I think the United States is an innovative country, and an advantage the United States has over other countries is a pool of people who are willing to risk on risky technologies. So I think that's the positive side. The negative side is when venture capital, they insist on returns, particularly through mergers and merger returns, as opposed to people starting their own companies. Now, I realize there's some tension in here because a pure IPO also generates a lot of money, but I guess it's a complicated story is what I end up going with. Yeah, because I think we like having new inventions, but they are part of the pressure that leads to that constant drumbeat towards needing to extract more money.
There also seems to be a perhaps under-examined story about consolidation within the VC market itself, and whether that upstream is also fueling more consolidation downstream. Okay, doesn't TikTok give some power back to the Davids, such as micro-influencers, or maybe it's still too early to tell?
I have a sort of a chapter on influencers. So I don't want to say that there's been no business models that have been driven by the open internet, because there are people who actually did, make money from their hobby. Some influencers have made money, and although there's a lot of burnout, it's definitely a job. You know what I mean? And I say that as opposed to being something that is more like owning a productive asset. There's sort of a difference. I don't want to bring in Marx a second, but influencers have, many of them, very fancy lives, but they, in some level, are part of the proletariat. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't a class change, if that makes sense. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I both welcome the fact that there has been new businesses made, but I feel like the platform's take is too much. And one of the challenges of our times is I feel like any business or even an individual who wants to start a new business or maybe invest in their own education, has to wonder how much the platform is going to take from them. You know what I mean? And so I think we have a crisis in some ways of really wanting to invest when you realize how much will be taken from you.
Is the Google story repeating itself with OpenAI now switching away from its nonprofit status?
I mean, I think yes. I think it's so abundantly obvious. And what's sort of sad about that story is they did seem to structure themselves pretty well. And then when push came to shove, the whole thing broke. So, unlike Wikipedia, the whole thing broke. But I do think that the same pattern is repeating itself. I think the founding of, I read Karen Howe's book, and I recommend that book as well, on Sam Altman's life and the career of OpenAI. And like many of these companies, OpenAI has some very appealing parts in its founding. This is, weirdly, I read that book, and I was like, I have to concede that Elon Musk is like the hero of this, because he has this instinct that Google is becoming too powerful and is going to take over everything, and he doesn't trust Google to be careful with AI, and so they feel like they've got to start something different. So it is kind of this noble beginning. But yes, as everyone has known, it just sort of fell into that same rut. And I guess that's kind of the sick culture that we need to fight, that everything has to be just something that makes individuals extraordinarily wealthy, and that somehow there's never any trade-off.
Local governments have been able to protect local hospitals and cab drivers to some extent from tech dominance. What unique challenges does the marketplace has that prevents local regulation from being an effective check?
I got to say, these are very good questions. I want to give credit to them. I do think local regulations can. So I maybe the question, maybe I'd sort of I do think local regulations can be effective, and so I'm not sure I disagree with it. I mean, overall, however, there is having worked in the state government and also in the federal government, there was a challenge in the states sometimes, at least acting individually, that you weren't sure they took you seriously sometimes. New York is maybe one of the few states, but like smaller states, I don't know, they really have to all band together. So some of this is, and one of the challenges, and I guess in our time, is actually maintaining sovereignty when we have units that are not as powerful as some of these companies. That's a real challenge. I mean, you'd be like, why don't you do something for the tech? And like, I'm like one lawyer in this state. What am I going to do to sue Google? It seems like unthinkable.
I mean, it has been interesting to see more and more states pass privacy laws, including with some still kind of coming into effect. I think Maryland recently had a new one come into effect that actually limits what you can do with sensitive data in terms of kind of conditioning access to services on it being sold. So it'll be interesting to see how firms are forced to respond. Okay, the next question is, how can we reshape our economic system to incentivize founders of private companies to be more like the Wikipedias and less like the Google and Amazons without decreasing the overall rate of innovation and entrepreneurship? And I guess one just addendum I would add is, I think there's one way to read your account that says, okay, the types of ethos that you're describing around could trace back to the 7 deadly sins in the Bible, right? At the end of the day, these are kind of fundamental, foundational things that human civilization has had to grapple with, namely, the personal whims, the personal greed of individuals that ends up being at odds with the social and public good. And one way to think about the rule of law and why we have our system of laws is to protect society from being subject to the whims of individuals when they're not using their good judgment. And so does this really come down to, we as a society have failed to create systems that are trying to, push human innovation in a positive direction and instead allowing it to succumb to these types of elements? Or is there something else that could be done?
I think you're getting at something, getting at the depth of the problem in the sense of it being, in some ways, a moral or cultural problem. I mean, I've studied a lot of the history of the computing industries, and there was a time, like in the 1970s, where what success meant was defined quite differently, I feel like. If you look at a lot of the internet founders, like John Pastel or something like that, they never really made a lot of money. Their glory lay in writing protocols, which seems like, something doesn't seem as well regarded now. But they'd write a protocol, live a simple life. The idea of a good life being one where you've made important contributions to science or to knowledge or to, something like that seems to have really left the tech world and replaced by this like numbers comparison of who's the richest and amounts of money that a human can't spend in their own lifetime. So I don't mean to get on the soapbox or become a preacher, but there is a decay. And even from when the time I was in Silicon, I spent a little time in Silicon Valley, just this strange, there's the cultural transformation of that place, where they used to sort of prize, it seems crazy to think of think different as a motto of Silicon Valley, or, Apple being this company that was fighting against the monopoly and the big machine and, in the 1984 ad. But there was a different, I think, ethos of what success meant. And it may have meant being rich, and making some money. Having a successful company, I think, was part of that. But we have this idea, which I think is bad for us that it's not enough to start a successful company, have a wealthy life. You know, you're a billionaire or you failed or something along those lines, and in tech. And that is doing, and that factor, which I credit again to the failures of the early thousands, has done an extraordinary amount of damage to our country.
Is it too late to put boundaries around how much tech can extract? They are now paying to play openly, such as Trump's inauguration. What can be done? Is it only policy?
I mean, I'm not optimistic about the short term, but I'm optimistic in a different sense, which is I think we are in a process of reckoning. We are looking back, and if there's one thing that gives me optimism, it's the ability of this country or even us as humanity to learn from our own mistakes. And we have let this one sector of the economy overgrow its boundaries and take over too much. And I think the people want something different. And ultimately, the people are more powerful than anything else. We have a we have sovereignty. Together, we have the ability to fight back. And I just think the public will has grown and grown and grown to say this is, and it's not just us individuals who seem divided, it's whole other industries feel like we're all, we're getting taken. We can't just have our entire economy extracted by a couple companies which run everything. So I admit it's an uphill battle, but I think even though tech companies may seem incredibly powerful, the rest of the country combined is even more powerful, and that is the challenge of our time.
Related question. How do you think about action items for the regular person? What should a normal person who sees these issues but is not a lawyer do? Not signing up for Prime or logging off of Twitter feels so small.
I mean, part of the challenge with market power and private power is that one individual is very small, and I think there is something in the choosing of alternatives. If you think about something like the environmental movement or the better food movement, if you want to call it that, it did partially come from choosing alternatives and shopping around. But that said, it's pretty hard to do. I mean, I said earlier, these are the essential infrastructures. It's particularly hard to do without Amazon, I'll say, for many people. Maybe there are people here who manage to do without it. But that is at some level why we need to band together, and that is why we need governments that are serious about these problems. I mean, it is crazy. It's sort of sometimes an American fallacy to think that a few scattered people can do something, when that is the reason we need governments that represent and reflect the democratic will of the people. And if we can't organize ourselves that way, we deserve what we get.
Okay, well, that feels like a very fitting note to end on. So congrats, Tim, on the fantastic book, and thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'm signing. I think I'm signing books here for people who have books. Yeah, so don't know. Yeah, I'm not in charge of that, but I think I'll be right here. So I think this is going to be a line.